Hey guys. Tonight we slip through the shadowed corridors of Windsor Castle, past velvet curtains that haven't been drawn in decades, and into a world preserved like a photograph, frozen in grief, cloaked in ritual, and lit only by the memory of one man. You're not just here to learn about Queen Victoria. You're here to walk beside her and understand why. For 40 years, she refused to share her bed. Not with anyone. Not ever again. The fire is already low when you enter. You can smell the ash, like burnt paper and something older, like the bottom of a cedar chest. There's a chill in the stone walls, the kind that sinks into your knees before you even notice it's there. The air has weight, as if someone just sighed and forgot to breathe back in. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere far away, tell me where you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your corner of the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle, not because you've snuck in, but because this room demands to be noticed. No one changes the linens here. No one moves the objects. Even the air feels protected, as if the dust particles were trained not to settle too heavily on anything sacred. It's the room where Prince Albert died, and Queen Victoria made sure it would always remain just that, his. The wallpaper hasn't been replaced. The small framed sketches still hang, faded, where his eyes once landed. The windows are clouded, not by neglect, but by time, as if they, too, have decided to mourn. You can almost hear the old grandfather clock in the hall counting every second that's passed since that final hour. Tick, 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 still ticking, but only just. She had the bed preserved exactly as it was. The sheets tucked precisely, the pillow fluffed but untouched. Every morning, a fresh jug of water is placed on the bedside table. Every evening, the curtains are drawn as if you were simply sleeping in, and no one dares ask why. It's not just about grief. Not really. It's about control, about holding onto the only part of life she didn't feel slipping away. You feel your fingers trace the edge of a silver photo frame near the dresser, except it's not a photo. It's a miniature portrait, painted in delicate strokes, of a man with eyes that could convince a nation to straighten its back. Prince Albert, handsome, disciplined, proper almost to a fault. He was German, remember, and back then, that mattered. He wasn't immediately loved by the British press, or the public. But Victoria? Victoria adored him, almost dangerously. Historians still argue whether it was love or dependence. But from the way she wrote about him, it was as if he were part of her own ribcage. When he died in 1861, everything collapsed. Not just her heart, but the entire rhythm of the court. Ministers waited weeks to hear from her. Letters piled up unopened. Events were cancelled. Even Parliament couldn't get a response. The British Empire, sun never setting and all, had no sunrise in her heart. Just fog. And here's a curious thing. Her children began calling that room the death chamber. Not out of cruelty, but because even they were haunted by it. You imagine little Arthur or Louise tiptoeing past the door like it might suck them in. The silence behind it heavier than any scolding. You lean a little closer to the ornate table by the window. And there it is, a ring. Not her wedding ring, his signet ring, still polished, still there. She wore it on a chain under her dress every single day for the next 40 years. Your feet shift and the floorboards moan softly beneath you. They're old, like everything else here, a slow, whining protest as if even the castle itself misses him. Because here's what they don't teach you in school. Queen Victoria didn't just lose a husband. She lost her anchor to reality. And she never found a replacement. The first night after his death, she didn't sleep. She sat upright in a chair until morning. The fire died out. Her tea went cold. No one had the courage to enter. She later wrote, The world is gone for me. And she meant it, not in a poetic way, in a bone-deep, soul-crushing, pull-the-curtains kind of way. From that night onward, she would never again sleep beside another human being. Her bed became a shrine, not a sanctuary, every object around it carefully preserved. There's even an account from a maid who says Victoria once scolded her, not for breaking something, but for moving it an inch too far from where he placed it. And just when you think the room has given you all its secrets, your eyes adjust to something near the fireplace, a pair of worn slippers. Men's size, still upright, still facing the hearth. No one knows who maintains them, but they're always there, as if he might slip back into them at any moment. The blue room doesn't belong to Victoria. It belongs to Albert. She only visited. Your knees ache slightly from standing on the stone too long. You shift your weight, and the cold travels up your legs like a whisper. You wonder how many times she stood in that very spot, looking at the exact same shadows flickering against the wallpaper, asking the same unspoken question. What do you do when the one person who understood you is gone? You'd think a queen would have distractions, an empire to run, children to raise, wars, colonies, trade routes. But no, for the first year, she barely left that room. Her doctors warned of nervous collapse. Her ministers threatened resignation. The people called her the Widow of Windsor, and not affectionately. It was as if the entire nation stood outside that locked door, asking, will she ever come back? But she didn't. Not really. And just as you start to rest against the mantel, fingers beginning to thaw, a faint rustle behind the curtain reminds you, this is only the beginning. Because in the next room, a small glass case holds something far more intimate than a crown or a robe. It holds a curl of hair, blonde, soft, the kind a wife would keep pressed in her journal. And we're about to step closer. You move softly, like you're sneaking through someone's memory. The corridor narrows a little, and with each quiet step, the floor seems to creak out a secret. Then you see it, beneath a glass dome on a wooden pedestal, barely taller than your hip. The light from a single candle flickers against the curved surface, making the object inside look like it's trembling. But it's not. It's a lock of hair. Not just any lock. This one is golden, soft, coiled like a sleeping cat's tail, and tied delicately with a faded ribbon that used to be blue. Probably before decades of lamplight faded it to ash. You lean in, almost embarrassed by how intimate it feels. That small curl was once part of a living man, and now it's a relic in a mausoleum that pretends to be a castle. This is Prince Albert's hair, snipped by Victoria herself on the day he died. Some say she even did it before he passed, already mourning the moment she saw coming. Historians still argue whether this was a common mourning custom or a private obsession taken a little too far. The pedestal it rests on isn't ornate. It's not grand. It's simple, oak, with faint carvings you might miss if you weren't this close. It's the kind of detail that whispers rather than shouts. And you realize, this wasn't meant for display. It was meant for her. She kept that lock of hair on her writing table at first, touched it every morning. Later, it moved to her private altar, surrounded by his letters, his favorite watch, and the last book he ever read. You imagine her fingers running over the paper, still feeling the warmth of his thoughts, the echo of ink. Your own hands tingle as if you've trespassed in a diary. And then there's the portrait, a small watercolor of him in uniform, no bigger than a notebook page. He's not smiling. Albert never really smiled in portraits, but his eyes are soft, painted by someone who clearly loved him, or knew someone who did. You step back, careful not to disturb the air. The scent here is faintly floral, like old rose water mixed with lavender sachets. That dusty, aristocratic kind of clean. But beneath it, always, is the faint tang of something else, like iron. Old pipes? Or is that just how memory smells? You shift your weight and feel the stiffness in your lower back. If you were a servant, you'd be in trouble for loitering. But you're not. You're a quiet witness to a queen's grief. The kind that hardens into ritual. Victoria didn't just keep a lock of hair. She kept dozens. Each child had one. Some ministers. Even her dogs. But Albert's was different. It wasn't preserved for sentiment. It was preserved like a holy relic. Like a saint's bone beneath a cathedral floor. And she didn't stop there. She had a life-sized statue made for the garden, where she sat beside it in silence. In her bedchamber, his dressing gown stayed on its hook. His shaving kit remained on the marble basin. Fresh towels were laid out every day. You hear that, and your knees almost buckle with the absurdity. A queen, ordering towels for a ghost. But to her, he wasn't gone. There's a story. One of those whispered ones that no one can quite verify, about her waking in the night and speaking to him. Out loud, asking him what he thought of a treaty, or whether the roast duck at supper was overdone. Her ladies-in-waiting said it was like watching someone have tea with an absence. And in a way, they were right. Victoria, after Albert's death, never really slept, not in the way people normally do. Her dreams weren't made of symbols or storylines. They were made of repetition. The same objects, the same bed, the same habits. It was as if she thought that doing everything exactly as before might conjure him back. Just once. And yet, she ruled. That's the strange part, isn't it? The whole time she was sinking into this ocean of mourning. The British Empire was swelling. India, Canada, South Africa. The world under her banner grew more vast than ever before. They called her the grandmother of Europe. But behind all that lace and power, there was just a woman clutching a curl of hair. It's easy to think she was fragile. But maybe this ritual, this odd little museum of grief, was her armor. Grief didn't stop her from being queen. It became the way she was queen. You move past the pedestal now. Deeper into the room where the fireplace breathes a soft red glow. There's a writing desk near the window. And on it, a small velvet box. Inside, his pen. The nib still stained faintly with blue ink. The last letter he wrote, unsent, unfinished, folded beside it. And here's the curious thing. The ink has barely faded. Because every year, without fail, she had it retraced by a court artist. To preserve the shade, the impression, the illusion of presence. That's dedication. Or maybe delusion. Historians still argue. You rest your palm on the edge of the writing desk. And you feel it. The smoothness of time. The faint notches where rings had scratched. Or where she drummed her fingers while waiting. It feels like touching the lip of a wineglass right after someone sipped from it, still warm. You imagine her sitting there in the morning, brushing away letters from prime ministers, opening only the ones marked with his initials. You imagine her rereading his old notes, not for meaning, but for voice, trying to remember the sound of him. And just as you begin to settle into that melancholy, you hear something unexpected, a creak from the other side of the room. A curtain shifts. You didn't notice the shadowy figure by the wall, tall, quiet, looming like an old pine tree in winter. It's not Albert. It's the man who would become her unlikely companion. A man with rough hands, a thick Scottish accent, and the social graces of a tavern bouncer. His name was John Brown, and the Queen was about to let him in. He steps into view slowly, as if he belongs to the shadows more than the light. His boots are muddy. His coat is wool, coarse and rumpled from the damp Scottish air. And yet, he doesn't bow, doesn't speak, either, just stands there, watching you the way a stag might regard a tourist, more annoyed than impressed. This is John Brown, the man who somehow got closer to Queen Victoria than anyone else after Albert. And he didn't do it with charm, or elegance, or politics. No, John Brown's appeal was something rougher, quieter, and strangely honest. He didn't treat her like a queen. He treated her like a woman who needed help standing up. You can almost hear his voice echoing off the walls in that thick, rolling brogue. Ye need some air. Ma'am, come walk me. No velvet courtesy. No, your majesty, unless he was annoyed. Just Brown. She met him long before Albert died. He was a gillie, a kind of gamekeeper, at Balmoral, their Scottish estate. But after the funeral, after the months of silent weeping and unopened letters, she summoned him to Windsor. Historians still argue whether she invited him for companionship or simply because no one else dared speak plainly to her. You shift uncomfortably. The hearth is still warm, but the chill from the hall seeps in under the door, curling around your ankles like a creeping fog. This man, this shaggy, unrefined Scot, was allowed where dukes and bishops were not. He walked her horses. He brought her shawls. He insisted, quite rudely, that she eat her breakfast before noon. She let him speak to her in ways no one else could. And you're beginning to understand why. After years of everyone tiptoeing around her grief, here was someone who knocked over the fine china and shrugged. Who told her when her bonnet looked ridiculous? Who made her laugh once, not a polite laugh, but a deep, unexpected chuckle that startled the footman holding the tea tray? And the curl of hair? The comb? The altar of mourning in her chambers? Brown didn't mock them. He didn't move them. But he didn't worship them either. He let them be, like family photos on a cluttered mantel, just part of the house. You picture them walking side by side at Balmoral. The Queen dressed head to toe in black silk and jet beads, and John in a thick tweed coat, leading her by the elbow through the mist and bracken. She would whisper about the weight in her chest, and he would grunt something like, "Ye need a nap." Not exactly court etiquette, but maybe that was the point. Everyone else treated her like a monument. Brown treated her like a woman who had survived something, and wasn't quite sure what to do next. Your fingertips brush the edge of a cane leaning against the wall. It's heavy, carved with a simple thistle motif. They say it was his, or maybe it was hers, gifted by him. No one's sure. It doesn't matter. What matters is how often he walked beside her, steadying her when her knees weakened. And not just from age. You feel that weakness now, in your own legs. It's subtle, but present, like standing too long in one emotion without shifting your weight. Grief is heavy that way. It settles in your joints, in your spine, in the bend of your neck when you look down at a keepsake too long. Victoria once said Brown was the only person who truly understood her. That line got under people's skin. Court gossip went feral. They whispered that he was more than a servant, that he shared her bed, that she had secretly married him. Even some of her own children began to side-eye him in the hallways. But the truth? That's harder to pin down. Some historians point to the letters, the gifts, the fact that she called him darling in her journal. Others say it was a maternal bond, like a woman clinging to the nearest oak tree during a storm. Either way, the intimacy was real. You can feel it in the walls here. She ordered a statue of him after he died. Not of him kneeling, not bowing, just standing, tall and unshaven, like he was waiting to escort her down a hill again. She had it placed in a quiet spot at Balmoral, and when people complained, especially courtiers, she simply ignored them. You imagine the two of them having tea together in silence. No violinists, no ministers, just a woman who lost her husband and the man who didn't ask her to move on. He died in 1883. She didn't speak for 3 days. Didn't write. Didn't eat. The court knew the signs by now. Knew not to intervene. It was Albert all over again. But quieter, more private, more bone deep. They found the handkerchief he always carried. She kept it beside her bed. And just like with Albert, she ordered a lock of his hair to be preserved. It was tucked into a tiny envelope marked, "From my faithful friend." You turn now, walking slowly past the curtains he once parted for her, past the chair where he used to sit during her long monologues. And you wonder, was he happy? Did he feel used? Did he love her? No one knows. But what we do know is this. He was the only man who ever walked through that grief-soaked bedroom without flinching. And just as you start to picture her sitting at her writing desk again, maybe sketching his silhouette from memory, your foot nudges something on the floor. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. You bend to pick it up, your knees cracking just a little from the cold. The ink is smudged, the handwriting sharp and small. It's not addressed to anyone. But the last line reads, "Even now, I cannot imagine sleeping while he is not in the world." You look up, and the next room is calling. Downstairs, in the servants' hall. They've been talking, and the story only gets stranger from here. You descend the back stairwell slowly, your hand grazing the cool iron of the banister, each step muffled by the thick runner rug worn thin by a century of silent footsteps. The deeper you go into Windsor's belly, the warmer the air gets, thicker, too, like the breath of dozens of people crammed into narrow stone passages, telling secrets over cracked teacups and stiff uniforms. Down here, in the underbelly of the royal residence, the atmosphere changes. It's less stiff, more human. There's the scent of starch and stew, of lye soap and boot polish, of long hours and quiet rebellion. This is the servants' world, and tonight, the whispers are louder than usual. You slip into the low-ceilinged hall where the maids and footmen gather for their end-of-shift tea. The table is long, the benches uneven, the laughter muffled but present. At the far end, near the scuffed cupboard filled with chipped plates and polished silver, someone leans in, voice lowered, brows raised. They're talking about her, again, more specifically, about him. John Brown, the Queen's Highland servant, the man who came from the mists of Balmoral and somehow, impossibly, now seems to haunt every hallway as thoroughly as Albert ever did. And while the upper floors remain heavy with mourning, here in the Undercroft, the mood is something closer to fascination. Did you see her hand on his arm at tea? She laughed at his joke. Laughed. She hasn't laughed since the prince passed. Not properly. They don't mean to gossip. Not really. It's more like, the kind of breathless curiosity you feel when something that isn't supposed to happen happens anyway, like watching a shadow bend the wrong way, or a statue blink. Your fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the wooden bench as you listen. The candle flickers low. Somewhere nearby, a kettle whistles, shrill and sudden like a gull over the sea. You notice, with the corner of your eye, a small portrait tucked halfway behind a curtain, a sketch of Queen Victoria in her widow's cap. But someone, cheeky or perhaps sentimental, has added a second figure in pencil behind her, a man with a thick beard and wide shoulders. Labeled, in faint script, Her Majesty and Mr. B. Of course, officially, Brown was just a servant, but the Queen's behavior blurred lines. She began to take meals with him when no one else was allowed. She called for him when she was sick, once even dismissing the royal physician with a scowl because, "Mr. Brown knows what I need." And his bedroom? Not down here with the other staff. He was moved to a chamber much closer to hers. Historians still argue whether this meant anything beyond convenience. After all, he was her personal attendant. He arranged her travel, managed her horses, guarded her privacy. But even so, even now, the phrase, "the Queen's stallion," still shows up in Victorian political cartoons of the time. Your back tenses slightly at the term. It's crude, it's unfair, and it says more about the culture of the time than about either of them. A woman showing devotion beyond grief. Surely she must have lost her virtue too. Right? But let's pause here for a moment. You imagine yourself in her shoes. You've lost the one person you trusted completely. The only person who made you feel both powerful and safe. You're queen, yes, but you're also a woman whose heart feels like it's been turned inside out. And then along comes someone unpolished, unaffected, and utterly unafraid of your title. Someone who holds your elbow not because it's protocol, but because the hallway floor is slippery and you're grieving too hard to see it. Wouldn't you let them in? The servants whisper another rumor. That she had a ring. A simple gold one, not part of the royal collection, that she wore only in her private quarters. And that, maybe, just maybe, it was given to her by Brown. No documents confirm this. No diary entry spills the secret. But even in her death, that ring was found on her finger, wrapped in a handkerchief marked with his initials. Draw your own conclusions. You shift now, your joints stiff from sitting, and the wooden bench groans beneath you like an old friend complaining. You rise, careful not to knock the teacup left abandoned by a half-dozing footman. Just before you go, you notice something scribbled into the worn edge of the wall. It's in chalk, faint, childish script, maybe a maid's joke, maybe something older. It says simply, "She loved him." You wonder how many generations of servants have read that in silence, wiping it away only to rewrite it again after the next evening meal. Because love wasn't supposed to look like this. Not for a monarch. Not in the empire's most tightly laced age. It wasn't supposed to be shrouded in wool coats and thick boots and early morning walks through fog. But maybe that's the only kind of love she could have. After Albert, one that asked nothing but presence. You ascend the stairs now. Past the rooms where the gossip drips like candle wax. Past the spaces where silence is not just protocol, but a kind of reverence. And with each step, the air cools again. The smell of soap and porridge fading into the crisp, sharp scent of floor wax and rosewater. You emerge once more into her private hallway. Dimly lit, draped in curtains. A hallway that's more like a throat leading to a heart. And that's where you see it. Her bedroom door. Locked. Always locked from the inside. Except for him. You're standing in front of her bedroom door now. The wood is polished to a mirror-like sheen. Though no one has touched it in years, at least. Not without permission. The doorknob is brass, dulled by time, and shaped like a lion's head. You place your hand near it. But don't turn it. You don't need to. Because you already know what's on the other side. The locked door is part of the legend now. Everyone in the palace knows it. Ministers, maids, guards. They all speak of it in hushed tones. Like a fairy tale turned into routine. No one, not even her children, was allowed into that room without her explicit word. Except John Brown. You hear the whisper of footsteps behind you. But no one's there. Just the creak of the old ceiling beams and the echo of memory. Your fingers brush the edge of the lion's mouth. Cold metal against warm skin. And you imagine it. The moment each night when Victoria turned the key herself. Sealing herself away from the living world. Inside, it's always quiet. The silence is so complete. You could hear a breath fall. There's no clock ticking. Hers stopped the day Albert died. The heavy curtains are drawn. Not for modesty, but because the sunlight feels like intrusion. She said it made her headache worse. But maybe it just made the emptiness clearer. The bed is large. Far too large for one person. A four-poster, carved of mahogany so dark it looks black in the candlelight. The mattress is made of horsehair, firm, unyielding, the kind that doesn't cradle but expects posture. Even so, only one half is ever used. The other remains perfectly smooth, like the surface of a frozen lake, waiting for someone who will never return. Every night, she climbs in slowly, still wearing the long black morning gown, still with his dressing robe folded neatly at her feet. Sometimes, she clutches it. Sometimes, she just lays her hand over it, like placing your palm on a headstone you're not ready to leave. Your shoulders begin to ache just from picturing her posture, upright, controlled, as if even her dreams had to obey protocol. Historians have tried to analyze the symbolism of her sleeping habits. They say it was about maintaining control, about ritual, about devotion. Others believe it was a kind of self-imposed penance. That by sleeping alone in a room she refused to change, she was forcing herself to remember what loss feels like, night after night. And then there are those who suggest something quieter, more human. That maybe she just couldn't bear the sound of another person breathing in that space. The bed sheets are white. Always white. Freshly laundered daily. Pressed by a maid who was never allowed to speak during the task. It's said that Victoria would sometimes sit in the chair beside the bed, staring at the maid's side, Albert's side, until the fire burned low and her tea went cold. Your throat feels dry. You imagine what it's like to keep a flame alive that long, not a literal one, but something deeper. The kind of grief that doesn't just visit, it moves in. Rearranges the furniture, and starts paying rent. On the nightstand, there's a small leather-bound book. Her journal, not the one kept for ministers or biographers. This one is for Albert. She wrote to him every day for decades, telling him about state visits, about the children, about the garden, and her headaches, and the way the sky looked at dusk. Some entries are long and winding. Others, just a few words. I missed you terribly today. I could not breathe without you. You notice something else. A single handkerchief, embroidered with tiny initials, A.E. Albert Edward, their son. But it's not his initials she carries. It's Albert's. Always Albert's. The other children mattered, of course. But not like he did. Not like he did. There's a painting on the far wall. Not of Albert, surprisingly, but of a dark forest path, half obscured by mist. You can barely see the figure walking through it. But she saw him. Always said it reminded her of the walks they used to take at Osborne. Every evening, before bed, she would speak to him. Out loud. Sometimes barely more than a whisper. Sometimes a full conversation. She never cared if the maid heard her. Once, she even told a new girl, "Do not interrupt me when I am speaking to the king." Even in death, he was her sovereign. You cross the room slowly, your feet sinking into the thick, hand-woven rug. Your bones feel the weight of the silence here. It's the kind of stillness that gathers in your joints, like fog in your lungs. Even the candlelight seems to flicker more softly in this room, as if afraid to cast shadows that might wake someone who isn't there. And then you hear it. Faint, but clear. The grandfather clock in the corridor, chiming once. Midnight, her hour. The time she most often wrote, or sat by the window, or simply sat in bed, eyes open, watching the fire crumble to orange ash. And you can feel the routine settle around you like a wool blanket. The maid placing the tea tray outside the door, backing away without knocking, the pages of the journal turning, the fire sighing low, the weight of Albert's robe at the foot of the bed, never moved, never touched by anyone but her. She slept alone not because she wanted to be alone, but because that's where he had been. And if she changed that, even once, it would be like admitting he was gone for good. And just as your hand brushes the edge of the wardrobe, its old wood warm from decades of firelight, you see something etched faintly into the inside panel, scratched in with what looks like the end of a hairpin. Still yours, always. The candle gutters, and through the window, the wind picks up, rattling the pane like someone asking to come in. You turn to leave, but as you do, you pass a long hallway where wax figures wait in silence. Figures that look too real, too still. And one of them is Albert, waiting, as if he'd never left at all. At first, you think you've wandered into some kind of dreamscape, a wax museum tucked inside the royal residence. Hidden from the public, not part of any tour. But no, this room isn't meant for visitors. It was created for her. The door creaks open gently behind you. The scent that greets you is thick with beeswax and lavender polish, tinged faintly with the underlying note of age-old velvet, a scent like time preserved in fabric. The floor muffles your steps with a carpet so plush your feet almost vanish into it. The air feels heavier here, dense with presence, though no one else breathes. Then you see them. They stand in a quiet line across the room, these wax figures. Life-sized, unsettling in their near-human stillness. Each one fashioned with exquisite detail. Not the sterile kind you find in tourist attractions, but handcrafted likenesses that seem to radiate a strange, slumbering soul. You pause in front of the tallest one. Prince Albert. His waxen gaze is fixed in that signature stare, not quite stern, not quite soft. He wears the blue uniform of the Royal Engineers, polished buttons gleaming under the low gaslight. His hand rests on a carved walking stick. His mustache, styled with uncanny accuracy, casts a shadow over lips that will never move. She commissioned this. Queen Victoria ordered his figure made by Madame Tussauds finest artist. But it was never meant to leave the palace. She placed it here, in this private chamber, like a sentry for her grief. And he isn't alone. You turn and see them, wax figures of her children. Young, rosy-cheeked versions, frozen mid-smile or mid-salute, like they've been told to hold still for just a minute too long. They stand in familial poses, some seated as if for a portrait, others posed with toys, with books, with dogs sculpted at their feet. The room is a tableau of a life that no longer exists. And in the center, her. Yes, there's a figure of Victoria too. Not in coronation robes, not seated on the throne, but wearing a simple gown of black silk, a shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes are cast downward. One hand rests lightly on a Bible. The other holds a folded letter. Historians still argue whether she commissioned that figure before or after Albert's death. Some say it was her way of showing the world what grief looked like. Others say it was merely another artifact in her growing collection of memory. A collection shaped not by ego, but by longing. You shiver, not because it's cold, the room is oddly warm, but because something about this space presses against the edges of your spine. These figures are too still, too carefully arranged, as if they're caught mid-thought, listening for a sound you haven't yet made. There's a chair against the far wall, wooden, curved, with a pillow that bears the faintest imprint. You imagine her sitting there, every evening, like clockwork, tea untouched, eyes moving slowly from one silent face to the next, as if daring them to blink, to speak, to come back. It's absurd, isn't it? A queen, empress of half the globe. And yet, here she sat, surrounded by wax and silence, looking for something she'd never find. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she didn't want to move on. Maybe she wanted to remember what it felt like to live before the silence swallowed her life. And these figures, strange as they are, were her anchors. You take a few more steps, careful not to knock over the rope barrier, not that you think it would stop anyone who truly belonged here. On the walls, portraits hang like afterthoughts, but your eyes are drawn to the table in the center of the room. On it, a small music box. You turn the crank once. Tentatively, a lullaby spills into the air, soft, tinny, mournful, the same one she played for her children at bedtime. It plays slowly, haltingly, like it's remembering the tune more than performing it. The sound curls around your ears, nestling there like breath against skin. And then, as if summoned, another fragment of memory surfaces. They say she sometimes brought new ladies in waiting to this room on their first day. Not to frighten them, but to explain herself. "This is my family," she once whispered to a young duchess. According to her memoir, "They are always with me." And in that moment, you understand the strangeness. Victoria's grief didn't isolate her. It crowded her. She wasn't alone. She was surrounded by echoes, by simulacra, by carefully arranged fragments of a world that no longer turned. Every night, she returned to this waxen family, as if refusing to let the world declare them gone. Your hand brushes one of the velvet curtains as you turn toward the exit. Dust rises like ghosts, catching in the light. Behind you, the music box stops. The silence returns, thicker now. Your chest feels tight, not from sorrow. Exactly, but from something more complicated. Sympathy, curiosity, maybe even admiration. Because it takes a certain kind of strength to love so fiercely that you'd rather rebuild the past from wax and velvet than let it vanish altogether. And just as your hand finds the door handle, you pause. You look back at the wax Albert. Still standing. Still waiting. His eyes, glassy, but not empty, seem to follow you. Maybe it's your imagination. Or maybe that's exactly what she wanted. And as you slip through the doorway, the corridor darkens. It's tea time now, and the queen has set only one cup. The hallway narrows again, but this time it's softer, lined with thick carpet and gilded sconces. The kind that hum quietly even when no one's around. You move toward the drawing room, a smaller parlor tucked into the east wing of Windsor. This is not the formal one. Not the room for ambassadors or bishops or war heroes. This is her room, her refuge, her ritual. It smells of bergamot and linen, tea and thyme. The door swings open without a sound, and the warmth inside hits you like a sigh. A low fire crackles in the hearth, casting shadows that stretch lazily across the patterned rug. The wallpaper is faded, cream and rose, edges curling slightly where sun and years have done their work. And there, near the window, two armchairs facing each other. One is empty, the other, always occupied. You walk toward the table between them. It's not grand, just polished oak, a little worn at the corners. A small dent where a teacup once landed too hard. On it sits a tea set, delicate china, white with pale blue flowers. 2 cups. 2 saucers, 1 pot, sugar in a shallow bowl, milk untouched, but only 1 cup is ever used. Hers. The other sits pristine, clean, cold. She never moved it, never asked for it to be taken away. Every afternoon, like clockwork, the second cup was placed across from her, always in the exact same spot, and always with the same quiet hope, or maybe command, that Albert might still be expected. You settle into the empty chair for a moment, just to feel the angle, to see what she saw, and suddenly it's easy to imagine, her black gloved fingers wrapped around the fragile handle. Her veil pushed back slightly, eyes lowered, not in sadness, but in conversation. You hear her voice, soft and proper. The lilies came early this year, my dear. And Lord Salisbury's latest proposal is insufferably dull. She speaks as if he's listening, as if he's right there, beyond the firelight, still nodding in that gentle way he always did when she rambled. Historians still argue whether this was performance or persistence, whether she believed in some spiritual continuation of their bond, or simply refused to let society dictate the proper length of grief. But even the doubters admit, this wasn't for show. She didn't do it at court. She didn't invite guests. She did it here, in this room, with this second cup. You lean closer and notice the faintest ring on the porcelain. A tea stain, old, ghostly, probably from the early years, when she still let her hand tremble over both cups. Before she realized he wasn't going to return, at least not in the way people do. Still, she kept the ritual. Day after day, year after year. One courtier once asked, very gently, if perhaps they should set only one place in future. She didn't respond. The next day, the courtier was reassigned to India. There's something sweet about it, isn't there? And something terrifying. That kind of devotion, locked so tightly into habit it becomes indistinguishable from religion. You can feel the intensity of it in your chest. A tightness that isn't pain. Exactly, but more like the pressure you get when holding your breath too long. Your hands itch slightly, a phantom warmth creeping up your wrist as if you've touched something still smoldering with feeling. On the sideboard sits a box of letters, tied in ribbon, perfectly aligned by year, all addressed the same way, to my beloved angel. They weren't mailed, of course not. They were placed in a drawer, or under his pillow, or next to the untouched teacup. One of them reads, simply, I am trying not to forget the sound of your footsteps. You swallow. There's a chill in the air again. But it isn't coming from the room, It's inside you now. The realization that this wasn't about remembering him. It was about refusing to let go. Every part of her day revolved around the absence of Albert as if he were still present. And the teacup? The teacup was the most tender symbol of all. It was the space she made for him. An emptiness cradled with care. They say when guests came to tea, on the rare occasions they were invited to this room, they were instructed never to touch that second cup. Never to speak about it. One child once reached for it, and Victoria's hand clamped down so fast, so sharp, the room fell into absolute silence. Even in her solitude, she was never alone. And you begin to notice something else in the room. A clock, shaped like a carriage, frozen at 4:25. The hour Albert used to return from his afternoon ride. It's been stopped for decades. Not broken, just set, eternally, to the time she liked best. When he would come through the door, muddy boots and soft voice, and sit across from her with a half smile and a full heart. You rise from the chair. The fire is low now, curling into itself like an animal going to sleep. You wonder if she watched it the same way. Eyes soft, not for the flame, but for the memories flickering inside it. You look back once more at the table. 2 cups, one warm, one waiting, and just as you step out into the corridor again, you hear a door close gently in the distance. She's getting ready for a public event now. Still dressed in black, still clutching the parasol like a weapon. The marble floors of the audience chamber stretch before you like an endless river of pale bone. Polished smooth, they reflect the gold leaf trim of the wainscoting and the muted colors of somber oil portraits lining the walls, past monarchs, generals, children lost to time. You walk slowly, the soles of your shoes scuffing softly, echoing just enough to feel like you're not entirely alone. And then you see her. Not in person, of course, but captured in a massive canvas, hung high above the fireplace. Too regal to touch, Queen Victoria, clad not in the velvet crimson of coronation robes, nor in white for youth and purity. No, she is dressed in black, as she was for most of her life after Albert's death. Jet beads glint faintly at her collar like frozen tears. A delicate lace veil frames her pale face. She looks like a figure from a forgotten cathedral, holy, impenetrable, exhausted. This is how she appeared in public for decades. At court functions, at jubilees, even at weddings, while others shimmered in color and silk. She remained wrapped in grief like it was her second skin. Black gloves, black gowns, black parasols. Her entire wardrobe became a uniform for mourning. You feel a tug in your spine from standing so upright. No slouching in this room. The weight of her gaze, frozen as it may be, demands posture. Demands stillness. And yet, beneath all that ceremonial presence, you can sense something else. Fragility disguised as iron. Her court dress was more than costume. It was armor. Historians often debate whether her refusal to shed mourning clothes was psychological dependence or shrewd branding. One scholar called it grief weaponized. Another, the fashion of penance. Whatever the motive, it worked. The public fell in love with the image of the tragic queen, the eternal widow. It made her human. It made her holy. And she played the part to perfection. She held audiences rarely. When she did, it was with minimum ceremony. Ministers described her as cold, withdrawn, sometimes blinking as if recalling who was speaking. But if anyone addressed her without proper reverence for Albert, she would correct them with icy precision. You see the throne now. Not the coronation chair. Not the one from Westminster. This one is simpler, upholstered in black silk. The armrests worn from decades of quiet fidgeting. She sat here often, flanked by towering potted palms, hands clasped, eyes unreadable, and always, beside her, on a second chair, always empty, lay something small, Albert's handkerchief, folded neatly. No one dared move it. That square of linen, yellowed with time and stiff with starch. stood in for his presence in court as much as she did. The rituals were exacting. Before every public appearance, she inspected the creases in her mourning dress, refused bright flowers in the room, refused music that felt too lively. Once, when a visiting dignitary suggested they toast her with champagne, she declined, saying, "There is nothing to celebrate." It had been 20 years since his death. Still, she wore the black. Still, she clutched her parasol like a life preserver. That parasol is here now, propped in a corner of the room. You move toward it. The fabric is thin but intact, embroidered with minute black roses along the hem. A subtle rebellion of detail in a world devoid of color. The handle is ivory, carved in the shape of a swan's neck. She gripped it tightly during long processions. Fingers gloved in crepe that left smudges on the polished handle. They said she held it so fiercely. It left an imprint on her palm long after each event. Your own fingers curl slightly at the thought. To the public, she was the widow queen. Mysterious, remote, eternal. The nation adjusted itself around her mourning. Mourning became the fashion. Entire industries bloomed around it. Mourning jewelry made of jet and onyx. Black-edged postcards. Even mourning bonnets for respectable ladies in shops. Imagine that. A whole empire in grief drag. It sounds absurd now, but back then, it was serious business. Mourning had rules, stages, deadlines, and yet Victoria outlasted them all. When people suggested she transition from full mourning to half mourning, maybe a little gray or lavender, she refused. "I will wear color when I meet him again," she once said, brushing off a suggestion from her daughter-in-law. And she meant it. When she rode in her carriage, she sat stiffly beneath layers of black lace, waving with the hand that didn't shake. Her veil hung like a curtain between herself and the world. But sometimes, just sometimes, a smile would slip through. Faint, brief, like a coin dropped into a deep well. And people cheered, because even the faintest warmth from a grieving queen was worth clinging to. You sit briefly on the edge of a bench near the tapestries. Your legs are tired now. Your back protests, just a little, reminding you that even standing in history's shadow can be exhausting. But you don't mind, not really, because what you're beginning to realize is this. Victoria's mourning wasn't about sadness anymore. It had become her language, her way of speaking to the world, her way of saying, "I am still here, but I am not whole." And as you rise again, stretching the stiffness from your knees, the long hallway calls. She's back in her writing room now, answering letters you wouldn't expect. You return to the west corridor, where the windows are tall and cold and the light falls in long, slanted stripes, like a sundial that never moves. This part of Windsor is quieter than the rest. Even the air feels hushed, as though it's always just heard someone crying. Her writing room waits at the end of the passage. Door half open. You step in, and it's exactly what you'd imagine for a queen who spent more time writing than speaking. There's a fireplace with a low, sulking flame, a rosewood desk, scratched by time and use. The inkpot is silver, the blotting paper stacked neatly. Nearby, a brass bell that summons servants, though most say she preferred silence when she worked. You can smell paper, ink, a faint trace of lavender soap. This was her command center, not of empire, but of memory. She sat here nearly every day, writing letters, long ones, short ones, stiff, formal replies to heads of state, gentle ones to her children abroad, notes of condolence to strangers, instructions to her dressmaker about the precise shade of black crepe for next week's church service. And most of all, letters to Albert. The desk drawer contains dozens of them, all written long after he died. Most begin with the same words, "My beloved one." She told no one she was doing this, not at first. But over time, it became her open secret. A few maids noticed, as did her private secretary. But none dared interfere. After all, she was still the queen. Still issuing orders. Still writing daily, even if the recipient hadn't been breathing for years. One such letter sits before you now. Unfolded, ink slightly faded, but clear. Her handwriting, sharp, disciplined, but shaking slightly on certain words, reveals a woman trying to control the uncontrollable. You read a line aloud. Quietly. The sun still rises. Though I do not see it. Your breath catches. This isn't drama. It's devotion turned inward, folding over itself like a letter sealed too many times. And yet, in the middle of this cathedral of mourning, there are strange intrusions. You notice a small stack of new letters. Unopened, thicker paper, strange handwriting. These aren't from Parliament or family. They're from spiritualists. Yes, them. Victoria, in her search for connection, became fascinated. Some might say obsessed, with the idea of speaking to the dead. Seances, mediums, spirit writing, all the fads that gripped Victorian drawing rooms like a fashionable fever. At first, she was skeptical, too grounded, too proper. But one day, a letter arrived from a French clairvoyant named Madame Laroche. In it, she claimed to have seen Albert in a dream, pacing a forest glade, asking for his dearest wife to light a candle on the hour of dusk. Victoria lit the candle. Nothing happened. Or maybe something did. The next week, she invited Madame Laroche to Osborne House. A séance was held, behind closed doors. Of course, and witnesses later claimed the Queen left the room pale but smiling. Historians still argue whether that smile was from hope or from theater. You glance to the corner of the room where a peculiar table stands. Round, covered in a white cloth. 3 chairs, and on top, an odd little device, a planchette. The kind used for automatic writing. A small, pencil-wielding triangle meant to be guided by spirits through human hands. She tried it, at least once. Her private journals mention the foolish motion of fingers beyond my own. She didn't believe fully, but she didn't not believe either. That ambiguity, the maybe, was enough to keep her coming back. You imagine her sitting here, eyes closed, hands on the board, whispering softly, "Albert, if you were near me," while the candle flickered and the maids waited outside. Pretending not to listen. The Victorian era was drenched in paradox, steam engines and ghost stories. Empire and ectoplasm. Iron bridges and fragile hearts. And here sat its queen, writing daily to a man beneath the earth. And maybe, just maybe, listening for him through the veil. She never told the public. Not really, but she did write a note to her daughter, Helena, which read, "If love is eternal, then the dead are never truly absent." You notice the temperature drop. Or maybe it's just you, standing too still for too long. You roll your shoulder, and your back cracks faintly like old paper bending. Even your body knows how long she waited. And then you see a letter, unsent. Its envelope blank, the ink fresh. The date? The week before John Brown's death. It reads, "I dreamed you both were in the garden. You didn't speak, but you smiled. Both, Albert and Brown." You step away, suddenly feeling as though you've wandered into a confession not meant for ears. And yet it's here, among the blotters and dust, as open as any royal decree. Maybe her grief had changed shape by then. Split in two. 2 men, 1 memory, 1 room. And just as you back toward the door, hand on the knob, you hear it again, soft, but real. The grandfather clock in the corridor. 1 chime. It's tea time again. And today, the Queen is already seated. Only 1 cup is poured. The clock's chime fades as you move once more down the west wing. Past a hallway where the light pools in faded gold. The Queen is seated, as always, not at a banquet table, not at her desk, but in her usual armchair by the parlor fire, its upholstery sagging just slightly under the constancy of her form. She's not alone, but the room feels empty all the same. The second chair sits across from her. Cup untouched. Steam curling like a whispered prayer into the quiet. Today's tea is Darjeeling, her favorite. Pale, floral, a little astringent. It fills the air with a scent both comforting and sharp. Like a memory you didn't know you still had. The tray is arranged just so. Spoon at 2 o'clock. Milk poured second, not first. Sugar cubes in an ornate silver bowl that hasn't been refilled since before breakfast. You stand behind her, not too close. Watching the back of her bonnet. The way her gloved fingers curve lightly around the porcelain. The room doesn't move. Nothing dares interrupt the rhythm. Because this tea time isn't about food or chatter. It's not even about routine anymore. It's about waiting. You can see it in her posture. Perfectly erect. Chin just tilted. Eyes not really focused on anything in particular. She's not reading. Not writing. Not even thinking. She's holding a space. And this space is his. Every day since 1861. This cup is poured. This chair arranged. And every day, it sits cooling. An elegant absurdity repeated across decades. Entire wars have begun and ended while that tea grew cold beside her. And still, she persists. You can almost hear her internal dialogue. If I said it just right. If I make no change. Then maybe the universe will remember what it forgot. That's grief. Not a storm. But a stillness. A waiting room that no one else sits in. On the wall above her hangs a portrait, not of Albert, but of the two of them together. Commissioned after his death, but painted to look like he was still beside her. She instructed the artist to include a detail that wasn't visible in any photograph. His hand resting over hers. When asked how she could be sure, she simply replied, because he always did. The air shifts. Someone walks by in the hall, a maid perhaps, but no knock follows. No tray is retrieved. The ritual must be complete before anything can be cleared. That's the rule. The queen rises when she chooses. Not before. You glance again at the cup. The tiniest ripple moves across its surface from the draft under the door. But to her, that might be enough. A sign, a breath, a hello from beyond. Historians still debate whether this daily ritual was born from faith or habit. Was she really expecting him? Or had the motions themselves become sacred? Something she could still control. When everything else was stolen. There's a curious document folded on the table near the tray. Not a letter. A receipt. From a company in Brighton that specialized in mourning goods, jet brooches. Black-edged stationery. Velvet ribbons. It's dated 1884. Over 20 years after his death. Still ordering the same items. Still signing her name as widow of Albert. Not queen. Not empress. Widow. Even her titles bent beneath that weight. You shift your footing. And the floor groans. She doesn't flinch. She wouldn't. She's used to ghosts, both real and imagined. Her whole world has been shaped by their presence. Albert in every frame, every corner, every silence. And yet, she survived. That's the strange thing, isn't it? She lived 40 years after him. Not as a recluse, not exactly. She governed. She grew old. She saw inventions he never dreamed of, photographs, telephones, light bulbs. The empire expanded, crumbled in places, and still she sat, black dress trailing, parasol resting, tea steeping. Maybe that's what made her so mythic. Not her power, but her refusal to let go. You wonder how the servants felt, walking past this daily pantomime, carrying out their duties as if tea time for two were entirely normal. Maybe, over time, it was normal. Grief institutionalized. A second cup set without thought. Like putting sugar in your own tea. Some of them probably found it sad. Others, comforting. Because isn't there something noble about honoring someone for that long? Your legs start to ache from standing so still. You sink into the guest chair, the one not meant for Albert, and instantly feel the difference. The cushions are less firm. The chair slightly off balance. Even furniture here seems to know its rank. You rest your fingers on the rim of the untouched cup. Still warm. The steam's slowed now, turning languid, like breath before sleep. And in this moment, you feel what she must have felt. That ache behind the eyes. That almost hallucination, where you're sure, just sure, you saw him out of the corner of your eye. It's a trick, of course. But it's a tender one. Then you spot the velvet pouch tucked behind the tea tray. You ease it open. Inside, a piece of paper, folded into quarters, yellowing at the creases. A menu, dated 1861. The last meal they shared. Game pie, boiled carrots, a wine jelly she didn't touch that night, and a scrawled note on the back in his hand. Tell the cook, less salt next time. My love, your heart feels something heavy and warm. She kept this, for decades, not because it was grand, but because it was his. And just as the teacup cools past the point of comfort, you hear the distant shuffle of heels. She's rising now. The chair creaks softly. The ritual ends. The tray will be taken. The cup washed. And tomorrow, it will all be done again. But for now, she steps toward the corridor. Still veiled. Still upright. Still, utterly alone. You trail behind her now, not too close, as she makes her way down the dim hallway. Her footsteps are slow but deliberate, as if each one must land in exactly the same place as yesterday's. Her shadow moves ahead of her, stretched long by the gaslight flickering from the sconces. She's heading toward her chambers again. Not to sleep, not yet, but to be near him. You follow the curve of the corridor and enter the room that once served as her private retreat, the sanctuary where no one entered unless summoned. It's darker than the others. The curtains remain drawn, the light carefully measured, never too bright, never too cheerful. She liked it that way. And at the center of the room, the bed. Large, stately, cold. The mattress is firm, too firm, if you're honest. The kind that doesn't invite rest so much as endure it. You move toward the far side, his side, and it's pristine. Untouched, not just unslept in, but unmoved. The sheets are as tight as the day they were first laid down. Not a wrinkle out of place. Not a crease to suggest someone had ever lain there. But there's a dip, small, subtle, as if someone used to sit there for just a moment each night. For 40 years, clutching something in their lap. And then you see it, folded gently on the edge of the mattress, like a relic on an altar, his dressing gown. It's faded now. The once deep burgundy has lightened to the color of old wine. The fabric, worn soft, carries the faint scent of pipe tobacco and sandalwood. You imagine her lifting it each night, pressing it to her chest, inhaling until her ribs ached. Not because it still smelled like him, because it once had. You reach for it instinctively. Then stop. There's something sacred here, something you shouldn't touch, even in imagination. The air around it feels heavier, almost protective. This isn't just a garment. It's a placeholder, a boundary, a promise. She kept it exactly where he left it the night he died. Folded in thirds, belt tucked, cuffs even. Historians debate whether she ever truly slept on that bed again. Some suggest she lay only on her own half, facing the gown, watching it through sleepless hours. Others think she might have moved to the chaise in the corner. No record confirms it, but the bed itself tells a story. The smoothness of the coverlet, the precision of the pillowcases, the way time has passed around it like a respectful but distant relative. Your spine aches now, just a little, the kind of ache that comes not from movement, but from stillness, from trying to maintain something you were never meant to carry alone. The room is filled with these quiet burdens. On the nightstand sits a photo album, well, not a photo album, not in the modern sense. More like a scrapbook. Bits of ribbon, newspaper clippings, a pressed violet, a note in German that simply says, "Don't forget your gloves." So mundane, so unbearably tender. On the mantel, a carriage clock ticks softly. It's the only thing in the room that moves. And even that, just barely. The tick is slow, muted, like it's been told to behave. Victoria wound it every Sunday. Personally, even when she stopped attending church, she wound the clock. Because Albert liked to know the time. You glance again at the dressing gown. The robe of a man who once ruled half of Europe's diplomatic mood from behind the throne, now folded. Revered, untouched. Your hand brushes the headboard as you step back. The wood is warm, not from the room, but from memory, from the number of times her hand must have rested there as she stood beside him. Asking for counsel, or kindness, or just a moment's breath. A maid once confessed, long after the Queen's death, that every evening Victoria whispered the same phrase before retiring. "Good night, my heart, I am still beside you." And she meant it, because in her mind, she never left his side. Not truly. The state, the world, the children, those were obligations. But this was devotion. And so she never remarried. Never even considered it. When Parliament floated the idea, very cautiously, very diplomatically, she responded not with words, but with silence. The kind of silence that hardens the air around it. The kind that tells you you've just crossed a sacred line. To Victoria, marriage wasn't just companionship. It was eternity, carved into daily life. Albert wasn't just a husband. He was a presence, a system, a moral compass. He was, quite literally, her other half. And so, she kept him with her. Not in a spiritual sense. In a physical one. In the dressing gown. In the bed left half made. In the teacup that never cooled from actual lips. But always cooled just the same. You glance around the room one last time. The fire's low. The scent of the past clings faintly to the drapes, part lavender, part old wool, part longing. You step away, your knees cracking softly like the pages of a too often read book. You pass through the doorway, careful not to brush the curtains, and feel the air lighten as you leave the chamber behind. But even as you move down the corridor, you feel it, the weight of that gown. Still folded, still waiting. Still the warmest thing in a room too cold for dreams. The fire fades behind you as you make your way toward the west drawing room, where glass cabinets line the walls and the air has that old paper stillness. Like a library that's held its breath for decades. The lighting here is always low, gentle, intentional, designed not to disturb, not the room, and certainly not its occupant. Because this is her sanctuary of remembrance. Not for ritual, not for grief, but for preservation. You cross the room slowly, carpet muffling your steps, and there, against the far wall, you see them. A row of wax cylinders, carefully labeled, protected under domed glass. Her early experiments with the phonograph. Not many people know she dabbled in sound. A voice caught on air? It was magic. Terrifying and sacred, but she never let them record her. Only Albert's letters, read aloud by someone else, placed close to the receiver so the device might remember his tone. You pause in front of one of the cylinders, heart slightly quickening. Just the idea of it, that she might have tried to summon his voice back not through seance this time, but through science, is almost too tender to bear. This was her pattern. Memory made physical. She collected pieces of Albert. Not in the grotesque way you might expect from a monarch entombed in her own grief, but in a methodical, practical, deeply human way. You can picture her here, sorting items into boxes, labeling drawers, calling them by name. His letters, his gloves, his spectacles. And you see them now. In the case near the window. His gloves are small, thinner than you'd expect, the kind worn by a gentleman on a walk, not in a war room. Leather, browned at the seams, creased where his knuckles once moved. She kept them in a cedar drawer for decades. The scent of that wood still lingers faintly, like time trying to cover its tracks. Beside the gloves, his spectacles. Delicate wire rims, one arm slightly bent, There's a note beneath them in her own handwriting. From the afternoon at Balmoral, when he read Gerda aloud. You feel it in your chest again. That flutter of ache, the sudden, visceral image of a younger Albert. Book in hand, voice calm, while she listened from a chaise. The fire crackling and Scotland's wind rattling at the windows. Historians still argue whether this obsessive cataloguing was a symptom of her grief or her strength. Was it madness, or memory weaponized? But when you see the drawers, each one labeled not with dates, but moods, it becomes clear. This wasn't chaos. It was devotion in archival form. A drawer labeled, Rain at Osborne. Another, the green waistcoat. Easter morning. These weren't just items. They were sensory anchors. If she touched them, she was there again. And maybe, just maybe, he was too. You rest your hand on the edge of one drawer. The wood is warm from the sun. And though you know it's impossible, it feels like something pulses beneath your palm. Memory, maybe, or dust, or just your own heart, beating a little too close to the edge. You look up and catch your reflection in the glass of the cabinet. And for a moment, you could swear she's standing behind you. Small, veiled, watching. But no, it's just the way the gaslight dances. Still, you move with a little more reverence now. Like you've stepped into a reliquary. Because in a way, you have. And here's the strangest thing. There's a box, locked, on the highest shelf. But the key? It's hanging on a ribbon beside it. As if she wanted it locked. But not impossible. You lift it carefully, fingers trembling slightly. Inside, tucked in cotton, is a miniature painting, tiny, oval, maybe the size of a locket. It's of Albert. Younger than most portraits, cheeks fuller, gaze more playful, his collar slightly askew, and behind it, a strand of her own hair, tied in black silk, matched to the same lock she kept from his. You sit with that for a moment. That the woman who ruled an empire, who terrified prime ministers, who ordered fleets and signed laws, still believed enough in the sacredness of hair to tuck this away like a schoolgirl in love. It's not insanity. It's intimacy. Something this world rarely grants women in power. She took it, held onto it, refused to apologize. And then, in the quietest rebellion of all, she preserved it. Even the lamps here seem to understand the gravity. Their glow is soft, amber, like candlelight in a church, or the warmth behind your eyelids when you close them against tears. You hear footsteps again in the corridor. Someone moving slowly. A maid, maybe, or just the creak of memory. Because just beyond this room, the clock is ticking, the hours drawing late, and even a queen must rise eventually. But before she does, before she extinguishes the flame, she'll walk through this room one last time. Run her fingers across a worn glove, straighten a folded waistcoat, and whisper, very softly, "Good night, my Albert." And you? You're already turning toward the next room, where a single cup waits, where shadows gather for tea, where even the sugar knows it must dissolve in silence. You find yourself back in that familiar parlor, not the grand drawing room, not the one with portraits and politics, but the quieter one where her tea tray is always waiting, as punctual as the sun, though never nearly as warm. The room seems unchanged, perfectly preserved in its habits. And yet, every day, something does change. The shadows. They creep just a little earlier now. Stretch just a little longer across the rug. And the teacup? It's already been set. Steam rising in that familiar curl. Spiraling toward the ceiling like a slow exhale. But again, only one cup is used. The other, always across from her chair, is untouched. You almost expect to see her now. Seated stiffly, black-clad and solemn, with the delicate saucer balanced on her lap and her gloved fingers curled around the fragile handle. But she's not here. Not yet. This is the in-between time, when the room fills with silence and habit and invisible presence. It's tea time with shadows. You sit quietly, as if not to disturb the ghosts. There's something reverent about this space. The fire crackles low. The wallpaper peels just slightly at the seam behind the cabinet, age tugging at perfection. But she wouldn't have minded. This was a room for presence, not polish. You glance at the second chair. The one meant for Albert. Or, perhaps, once meant for him. Because you notice something different now. The cushion. It's been recently fluffed. Not sat in. No indentation. No heat. But the fabric is newer. Replaced. Maybe. As if someone, at some point, couldn't help but maintain the ritual. Even if they didn't fully understand it. Maybe it was a maid. Maybe it was her daughter. Maybe it was Victoria herself. Ensuring the illusion stayed precise. It's strange, isn't it? To pour tea for someone who's been dead for 40 years. And yet, here you are, watching the steam rise as if he's only just gone to fetch a book from the shelf. The silver teaspoon beside the empty cup catches the firelight. It's been polished recently, more recently than anything else in the room. You can almost see your reflection in it, a little warped. But still there, so maybe that's the trick. Keep the room clean, keep the cup warm, and maybe, he'll return. Victoria once wrote in her diary, "Every day I expect to see him sitting there again. With his dear smile and wise eyes. Not hope to, expect to. The difference is everything. Your back begins to ache slightly from sitting so straight. You shift, the chair creaks, and in that small sound, the room seems to settle even further into itself. The floorboards murmur, the wallpaper holds its breath. And then, across the table, you see it, a sugar bowl, 3 cubes missing. And no one in this palace, certainly not Victoria, ever took more than one. The servants? They'd never dare. So who took them? It's probably nothing. A quirk of the day. A miscount. But part of you, just part, wonders. There's something so gentle about the idea of ghosts with sweet teeth. Grief with sugar. Absence made palatable. Maybe that's what she was doing. Sweetening the silence. You close your eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the room cradle your senses. The fire, the velvet cushions, the faint rustle of the lace curtain caught in a draft. You can almost feel her here, walking past you, not quickly, but with purpose. She'd pause by the mantel, adjust the photograph of the two of them on their wedding day. Not smile, but nod, as if acknowledging it all. The years, the distance, the decisions, the silence. Then she'd sit, lift the cup, sip, not because she's thirsty, but because that's what one does. Because if you skip even one part of the ritual, you risk unraveling everything. Historians often dismiss this room. They focus on the war cabinets, the royal councils, the journals. But this space? This odd little corner where grief is served daily in porcelain cups. This is where the true queen lived. Not the ruler of empires. The widow who survived. You rise from your seat. Carefully. Respectfully. The cup is still half full. The shadows have lengthened again. Soon, she'll enter. Sit where she always does. And speak, quietly, to no one. About the weather. About her aching wrist. About the way the roses didn't bloom quite as they used to. You leave the room gently, pulling the door shut behind you with a soft click. And beyond it, the conversation begins. One voice, 2 cups, and memories steeping in warm silence. You step back into the hallway and already, you feel the shift. The air cools slightly. The mood tightens. The quiet becomes heavier, less like peace, more like expectation. The queen is preparing for an appearance. You follow the rustle of fabric and the soft click of boot heels on tile. Until you reach her dressing room. Here, it's all hushed efficiency. 2 maids stand near the wardrobe, their hands folded, waiting for instruction. A third kneels beside a trunk, carefully brushing lint from a folded black parasol. The atmosphere is reverent, not because royalty demands it, but because grief enforces it. This is the moment when Victoria becomes her public self again. A widow in court dress. You watch as they lift her gown from its padded hanger. It's heavier than it looks, yards of thick black silk, overlaid with layers of mourning crepe. No color, no shimmer, only the dull sheen of well-worn sorrow. The jet beads sewn into the bodice don't sparkle, they drink the light. Like tiny obsidian seeds sewn into her chest. The gloves are laid out next, thin, black, buttoned at the wrist. Her fingers slip into them as if they never left. They've become part of her. Like skin, like memory. She sits for a moment on the edge of the velvet stool. Back straight, eyes forward. A maid carefully lifts her veil. It's not a bridal veil. Not the kind of thing made to be lifted in joy. This one is heavy, dense, a curtain between her and the world. It wraps around her bonnet and cascades down her back, long enough to sweep the floor if she doesn't carry herself just so. She doesn't speak. She rarely does during this process. But the air around her is charged with something tight and buzzing. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but waiting. The corset is fastened, her boots laced. The brooch, Albert's profile, carved in onyx, is pinned to her collar with practiced precision. She glances down only once, adjusts it by a fraction, and says nothing, but the room exhales slightly, knowing she's pleased. Her walking stick is handed to her. You recognize it now, not just as an aid, but as an extension of her presence. Ebony, with a silver top engraved with the royal crest. She doesn't need it to walk. She needs it to hold herself upright in front of a world that's always watching. Even now, decades after Albert's death, she dresses as though he might appear at any moment, just around the corner. Just out of sight, every pleat and button is placed for him. Not for the crowd, not for history, just him. You feel your own back stiffen slightly, involuntarily mirroring her posture. This isn't fashion. This is armor. It's easy to forget, amidst all the mourning, that Victoria still ruled an empire. That even while her heart remained suspended in 1861, her hands continued to sign laws, commission railways, and rewrite the world map. And yet, even in those moments, she did so in black silk, never shedding the uniform of loss. Even her handkerchiefs were dyed in mourning gray. And when the court suggested she might lighten her dress for her jubilee, perhaps wear purple or lavender, a signal of renewal, she replied, "There is no jubilee without him." Her eyes in the mirror don't blink. They hold that same distant steadiness you've seen in portraits. A gaze that looks through things, not at them, but every so often, her expression flickers, like candlelight catching a draft. Perhaps she's remembering the first time he fastened her glove, or the sound of his voice behind her when she laced her boots. That soft, domestic intimacy that outlives even the grandest coronation. You glance at the mirror yourself, half expecting something to move in the background. But no, only the reflection of absence. Perfectly dressed, one of the maids offers a handkerchief, embroidered, as always, with a black border and a tiny AV monogram. Albert Victor? No. Alexandrina Victoria. But maybe a little of both. You watch as she stands now. Full height, shoulders square. She lifts the parasol, not to shield her from the sun, but as a barrier, a symbol, a ward. The world might still expect smiles and waves and proclamations. But she has drawn a line. The parasol keeps her intact. And then she walks. The doors open before her. One by one, courtiers straighten, guards bow, musicians pause mid-note. The procession forms, quiet and formal, like a river moving downhill. And at the center of it all, a woman in mourning. Not weeping, not broken, but consecrated. You remain behind for a moment, in the hush after her departure. And it's then you notice the gloves she left behind. The old ones, the worn pair, frayed at the edges, thinner in the fingers, not fit for public view, but still warm, still faintly shaped by the curve of her hand. You pick one up, hesitating. And for a second, you imagine what it's like to wear grief like silk, like armor, like skin. And then, far down the hall, you hear the murmur of voices. The Queen is entering the audience chamber. And the letters have begun to pile up again. The doors to the audience chamber swing shut behind her with a whisper of finality. On the other side, the Queen is a statue, veiled, silent, seated before the petitions of a nation. But you remain in the hallway, just outside that wall of protocol, turning toward the smaller chamber tucked behind the main hall. It's her writing room, not the quiet sanctuary of grief you saw before, but the practical one, the place where correspondence is handled, where names are checked, decisions made, and ink stains the fingers of monarchy. You step inside and the air carries the faint aroma of wax seals and powdered envelopes. The windows are high, clouded by dust and condensation, but the light still finds a way in, falling like ribbons over a sea of paper. Stacks of letters cover the desk. Some are opened, most are not. You move closer and realize something odd. Many are addressed not to the Queen directly, but to him, to Albert. You pick one up gently. The handwriting is shaky, the ink smudged in places. A woman in Leeds, writing in 1879, pleading with the prince to bless her dying son. But Albert had been dead 18 years. You set it down carefully. These weren't misdirected. They were answered, not always, and not formally, but in the Queen's handwriting, in her steady, clipped tone. Some responses were brief, a line or two. Others meandered over pages. They never said, "He is gone." Instead, she spoke as though passing along a message. The prince would have been touched by your words. His sympathy would be yours in such sorrow. She became a ghostwriter for a ghost. You lift a journal from the side table. Inside, a list, not of events or duties, but of names, people she never met, people who wrote in pain. And beside each one, a simple notation. Reply sent. Candle lit. Remembered. Victoria didn't just mourn. She channeled. And not in the supernatural sense. Not always. She let herself become a vessel. Not just for Albert's memory, but for the pain of others. A national mirror of sorrow. It's easy to forget, now, that death was everywhere in the 19th century. Cholera, consumption, accidents, wars, and in a world where loss was constant. Here was a monarch who had refused to let go. To many, that was a comfort. Your eyes drift to the side table. A box sits there, small, walnut, the latch delicate. You open it. Inside are pressed violets, brittle with time, a ribbon, still faintly blue, and dozens of short letters. Not addressed to Albert, not to ministers, to strangers, to grieving mothers, widows, fathers who'd lost sons, children who'd written about their pets. Each one received a reply. From the Queen, from the widow, in her own hand. Sometimes it was only, "I understand." And somehow, that was enough. You sit for a moment in her chair. It creaks gently under your weight. But it's comforting, like an old friend making room. Your fingers brush a blotter stained with black ink. You imagine her here, shoulders stooped not from age, but from emotion, her pen moving slowly, each word a tether to someone else's pain. Historians rarely mention these letters. They focus on wars, on diplomacy, on scandals. But here, in this quiet room, a different kind of ruling took place. Not through law or army, but through acknowledgement. You look again at the pile of unanswered envelopes. One is from a child, drawn in crayon, a little crooked, a picture of two stick figures holding hands. The note reads, "My granddad died. Will he see your husband up there?" And beneath it, in faint pencil, "Yes, darling, I believe he will." You feel that one like a soft blow to the ribs. That weightless sadness, that deep, hollow tenderness, it sinks into you slowly. You stand, not wanting to disturb the desk further. And as you turn, you notice something else. A book, tucked on the lowest shelf. Its title embossed in gold leaf, though now worn. Words left unsent. You open it. Empty. Blank pages. Perhaps meant for him. Perhaps meant for herself. Or maybe for someone like you. Someone who wandered too far down a hallway one night, expecting answers and finding only stillness. A final page is dog-eared, written in her unmistakable script. I write because I cannot speak. I reply because I cannot be silent. You let the book close with a soft thump. And outside the door, you hear the rustle of skirts again. The Queen is returning, not to speak, not to write, but to listen, because the psychic has arrived. And tonight, she claims to have a message. The candlelight flickers as the door closes behind you, and the hush in the drawing room tightens like a thread stretched too long. The air feels different here, not musty, not heavy, but charged, like the breath before thunder. You blink into the dimness. 3 chairs, a small table, no windows open tonight, and across from the Queen, a figure in violet, the psychic, Madame Balmoral, though that's not her real name, of course. Real names are inconvenient in this business. What matters are results, and she has delivered enough. Enough to be summoned again. You slip quietly along the edges of the room, your footsteps swallowed by thick rugs. She's already begun. Her voice is low, smooth, with a practiced hush. You know the type, half mystery, half theater. Victoria sits absolutely still, gloved hands folded in her lap. She watches with the quiet of a statue. And you can't help but notice how tightly she's gripping her fan, even though no one fans in winter. I feel a presence, Madame Balmoral murmurs, eyes closed. He is here, waiting, watching over you. No name yet. That would be too soon. But Victoria doesn't flinch. She's done this before. The room smells faintly of beeswax and dried lavender. Not enough to comfort, just enough to remind you that someone tried. The psychic's hand floats up, tracing the air. He carries something. A small object, metal. Victoria stiffens. Albert had carried a silver match case. A gift from her, engraved. No one outside the family should know that. Except, of course, they do. Everything about her grief has been documented, dissected, whispered over. Even a second-rate medium could have done her homework. And yet, your skin tingles anyway, because the Queen wants it to be true. Her belief fills the room like perfume, unseen, but impossible to ignore. Madame Balmoral continues, voice more certain now. He says he watches over the children, the grandchildren. He approves of the young one's education. A safe bet. There were always children, and always concerns. But Victoria nods. Her veil trembles slightly as she exhales. She is starved for words in his voice. Even secondhand, even counterfeit. And isn't that what grief does? It softens the borders of belief. You glance to the sideboard. A small notebook lies open, next to a cup of untouched tea. On the page, a list of questions. Simple, formal, heartbreaking. Does he still visit Osborne? Did he approve of the Indian portraits? Does he forgive me for continuing? Not for remarrying. She never did. But for continuing. Sometimes. That's the deeper betrayal. The psychic pauses. Her hand flutters toward the flame of the nearest candle. He's fading, she whispers. Of course he is. That's the trick. You feel a tiny pressure in your chest. As if you were holding something in. Grief. Disbelief. Breath. You shift your weight, and the floorboard creaks beneath your shoe. Victoria turns her head slightly. Not toward the sound. Just enough to show she noticed. She is always aware of the room. The moment breaks when the psychic opens her eyes. Pale. Wet at the corners. Theatrical. Yes. But still human. I believe that is all he could offer tonight. Victoria doesn't reply. She reaches instead for the locket at her neck. The same one she has worn every day since 1861. It contains a lock of his hair. She presses it gently to her lips. And just like that, the audience is over. No applause. No verdict. Just the soft rustle of silk as she rises from her chair. The psychic waits, still seated, her hands folded now. She does not smile. She knows better. This was never about convincing. It was about soothing. And she has done enough. Victoria walks slowly from the room, one hand trailing against the polished sideboard, as though tethering herself to something real. And you follow her, down a hall dimly lit by gas lamps, past servants who lower their eyes as she passes. She pauses by a portrait in the gallery. Not of Albert, of them both, painted long before the years added gray to her hair or furrows to her brow. They are young here, vibrant. The painting glows, not with art, but memory. She stares at it for a long moment. And then, in the softest voice, barely audible above your breath, she says, "He would never have spoken that way." A confession, not of faith, but of knowing. She walks on, leaving the moment behind like a loose thread. And you remain, staring at the painting, at the curve of Albert's hand on her shoulder, at the light in her painted eyes, at the impossible, unreachable before. Outside, the wind picks up, the palace groans, and down the corridor, somewhere behind closed doors, a voice is writing again. Because when spirits fall silent, the pen must take over. And this time, the Queen's reply will be short. You follow the candle's flickering shadow into the narrow corridor just beyond the gallery, where oil paintings give way to modest sketches and framed scraps of pressed flowers. This part of the palace isn't meant for guests. It hums with the soft clatter of time, grandfather clocks ticking faintly, floorboards creaking in rhythm with the wind pressing gently against the old glass panes. This is where she keeps the letters. Not the ones from ministers or monarchs, those rest neatly categorized in the royal archive. No, these are tucked away in carved walnut chests and faded leather folios. Her private letters, the ones she never sent. You pause at the door, your palm resting on the cool brass handle. It opens with a sigh, revealing a room more like a study in a quiet boarding school than anything belonging to a queen. The carpet is worn in a gentle oval, a perfect loop from writing desk to fireplace to armchair and back again. A half-burnt log leans in the grate, cold now but not long so. On the desk, tied with lavender ribbon, are the letters, all addressed the same way. My dearest love, each one, dated, from 1861 all the way through 1900. 39 years of writing to a man who could never reply. You pick up a letter from 1873. The ink has bled slightly along the fibers of the paper, but the handwriting remains steady. You read slowly, the candlelight dancing across her words. I saw the violets bloom today by the orangery. They looked quite as they did the year you planted them. And I wondered if you remembered. She pauses there, a long dash, then more. I keep your chair just so. The servants know never to move it. I hope that is pleasing to you. You set the page down. She never intended for anyone to read these. And yet she kept them. Labeled, stacked, preserved like fragile petals between pages. In another letter, 1884. This one, you find a different tone. The Prime Minister speaks of alliances and ambition. But all I see is fog across the hills. I long for your counsel. I long for your hand. I long to stop pretending I do not. Your hands feel cold suddenly. And your breath moves through the air in little silver ghosts. The room is drafty. The kind of chill that settles behind your knees and in the corners of your collar. You sit in her chair. It welcomes you, slightly tilted forward, the way someone does when they're hoping to hear from behind a closed door. The desk still smells faintly of sandalwood and ink. There are nicks along its edge. One, in particular, looks like it was made in frustration. A sharp corner, dented deep. You run your fingers along it. And suddenly it hits you, not sadness. Exactly, but a kind of reverence. As though the room itself were a reliquary. Not of sainthood, but of longing. Not of devotion to a country, but to a man now long gone. Historians argue over what these letters reveal. Some believe they show madness. Others see the deepest love. And some, of course, suggest strategy. A queen casting herself as the eternal widow, wielding sympathy like a scepter. But when you sit here, where she sat, and feel the shape of her grief in every object, every preserved letter, you know the truth isn't so clean. She was a woman of iron will and cracked porcelain. She ruled an empire and clung to a dream. You rise carefully. A folio falls open as you do. A page slips out. This one is different. Unaddressed. No date. Just a single line. If I stop writing, you will disappear. It's hard to know if she meant him or herself. Your fingers tremble slightly as you slip the page back in place. The room darkens. Not from nightfall, but from the candle finally dying. Its wick curling into a tiny, fragrant thread of smoke. You open the window to let it drift out. And beyond the glass, the gardens lie motionless, silvered by frost. Somewhere out there, the violets wait, the ones she wrote about. You imagine them now, thin, brave things pushing through the soil like memories that refused to fade. Behind you, the folios remain. Dozens, hundreds, unsent but never unread. Because each one preserved something bigger than words. They preserved her. And as you step back into the hall, your shoulder brushing the tapestry by the door, you can almost hear the soft rustle of pages behind you. Still whispering, still remembering. The hallway narrows as you move deeper into the palace. Past portraits that no longer look down with pride but with something quieter, melancholy. Maybe, or resignation. Their eyes glint in the gaslight like they, too, are remembering. Your feet carry you toward the east wing. The air thickens here, not from dust or time, but from expectation. Because at the very end of this hallway, tucked behind a curtain and half concealed by an arched alcove, is the room that most staff pretend doesn't exist. It's not on the official plans. No visitors are shown here. But the Queen returns often. It's called the Room of Echoes. A nickname, of course. But one so persistent that even the guards use it now. You push the curtain aside. There's no grand reveal. No supernatural wind or eerie chill. Just a small chamber paneled in dark wood, with bookshelves lining 3 walls and a simple sofa in the center. Facing nothing but a wall of unlit candles. At first glance, it's nothing. And yet, when you step inside, you feel it. The room hums. Not audibly, not even tangibly. It's more like standing near a person who's just been crying. Everything around them feels swollen with unshed words. There's a table to the left. On it, a device. A strange one. Brass and wood, with wires looping like ivy. And a horn resembling an old phonograph. It's an early spiritoscope. A cross between scientific curiosity and seance toy. It never worked, of course. Or at least, not how its inventor promised. But Victoria wanted it to work. She had it built after hearing rumors from America. Mediums in Boston claiming they could hear voices through the vibrations of wires and wax. The Queen, ever the skeptic in public, had one commissioned in secret. No record of its maker exists. It bears no royal insignia. Just a tiny inscription, scratched faintly on the underside, to reach what cannot return. You kneel before it. Dust coats the metal. The dial is stuck, fixed forever on seek. There's no static, no whisper. But if you press your ear to the horn, the silence feels crowded. That's the best you can describe it. Like silence that isn't empty, but occupied. And perhaps that's what she felt, too. Victoria sat in this room for hours. Staff whispered. No visitors allowed. No letters brought in. Sometimes she would light all the candles. sometimes none. But she always brought the same thing: a cushion, a blanket, and the little carved box containing Albert's letters. It became a ritual. Sit, listen, wait. Some say she spoke aloud. Some say she merely nodded. Others swore they heard laughter once. Historians still argue whether she was clinging to memory or spiraling into delusion. But here, in this room, none of that matters. Because here, you understand something. She wasn't waiting for proof. She was waiting for presence. And that's a different thing entirely. You turn toward the back shelf. Books line it like soldiers at rest, leather-bound journals, spiritualist pamphlets, and notes written in her own hand, scribbled between margins. One stands out, a slim volume titled Vibrations of the Invisible. Inside are diagrams of human energy fields, notated in neat, cramped script, and a passage is circled. Where grief is constant, the veil thins. What is longed for may draw nearer, not to speak, but to settle beside. You run your finger beneath that line. And just for a moment, you feel warmth, not on your skin, exactly, but next to it, like someone sitting beside you who doesn't want to be seen, only known. You look up. The room is unchanged. And yet, you no longer feel alone. You imagine Victoria here, bundled in her shawl, whispering to the dark, not asking for him to speak, just asking for him to stay. In a world that kept moving on, where even her own children urged her to recover, this room became her rebellion. Not against death, but against forgetting. The candles flicker suddenly, perhaps just the wind outside. But you rise anyway. Your knees creak, and the floor groans under your step like it's acknowledging your departure. As you step back into the corridor, you glance once over your shoulder. The curtain sways slightly, not with wind, but with memory, and down the hallway, another room waits, where mourning shifts into something stranger still. Because even the strongest grief sometimes turns to command. Your steps now carry you toward the most peculiar chamber in the palace, a room few ever entered. And fewer still dared to speak of. It's deeper within the private quarters. Past velvet drapes and gilt mirrors dulled by time. Through a heavy door locked with a key worn smooth from use. This is the Indian room. It shouldn't feel so different. And yet, it does. The moment you cross the threshold, the air thickens, scented with sandalwood and old ink, layered with the hush of careful reverence. Rich tapestries line the walls, embroidered with gold thread that catches the light like the shimmer of a dream. Intricate wooden panels, carved by hand and shipped from the subcontinent, surround the room like a carved shrine. Cushions and incense trays lie in precise arrangement, untouched, as if waiting for a ceremony that's been postponed indefinitely. This was her sanctuary, but not just for solitude, for connection, because this is where Queen Victoria came to sit with Abdul Karim. A name often scrubbed from the royal record, whispered only in controversy. He was her Indian servant, later her munshi, teacher, confidant, companion. To some, a scandal. To her, a bomb. You imagine her now, seated on the floor beside him, attempting to mimic the posture of cross-legged serenity, all while wrapped in layers of heavy mourning crepe. Her back likely protested, her knees certainly did, but she persisted. Because here, she wasn't a queen. She was a student. She learned Urdu, asked about Islamic traditions, tasted spiced dishes far outside the bounds of British cuisine. She allowed herself to feel foreign, not to dominate, but to understand, and that, perhaps, was more radical than anyone expected. Historians still debate the depth of their bond. Some claim it was purely intellectual. Others point to tender letters, or the granting of personal gifts, to suggest something deeper, though always chaste, always veiled in the modesty of grief and propriety. But whatever it was not tolerated. Courtiers bristled, ministers hissed behind velvet doors. Even her own children recoiled. The idea that their queen, their matriarch, would allow a colonial subject such intimacy. It shook the fragile hierarchy that sustained the empire's myth. They tried to erase him. Burned letters, confiscated diaries, removed portraits. And yet, here in this room, he remains. A small, carved chest still sits on the low table. You open it carefully. Inside, his writing implements, his ink pot, a few worn letters she never let them destroy. One reads, "My dearest friend, I thank you for the peace you bring. In this storm of duty and sorrow, your words are like the jasmine breeze of Agra. Your breath catches. It's not poetry, it's shelter. Because after decades of sleeping alone, of writing to a man who could not reply, of carrying an empire on her shoulders, Victoria found something rare, a living soul who did not ask her to be strong, only to be present. You sink into one of the floor cushions. It sighs beneath your weight like it remembers her. You imagine the scent of cardamom tea lingering in the air, the quiet tones of Urdu drifting softly as Kareem read from a letter, or translated a poem about loss, or joy, or reincarnation, and you imagine her eyes, usually steeled by ceremony, softening. Not because she forgot Albert, but because, for a moment, she didn't have to. That's the strangest shape grief can take. It makes room for new life. Not to replace the old, but to stand beside it. Still, not everyone agreed she had the right. The scandal over Abdul Karim lasted years. Even after her death, the royal family moved swiftly to dismantle any record of his importance. His quarters were searched, his papers taken, his return to India swift and silent. But the room remains, a stubborn echo. The pillows are still plump. The tea trays still gleam. One of the tapestries even bears his name, stitched in tiny golden letters, hard to find unless you're looking. You are, and you find it. You smile. Because in this secret, silken space, Victoria allowed herself one final rebellion. Not against Albert, not even against death, but against the idea that grief must always mean isolation. She chose company, and in doing so, invited light into a room long shrouded in shadow. As you rise, your joints ache gently from the low seat. You stretch, and the fabric of the room seems to shift around you, as though accommodating your motion. You pause at the door and look back. One candle flickers still, and just as you're about to step away, the scent of rose attar and cedar wafts across your senses, a soft goodbye. Or maybe just your imagination. Either way, you carry it with you. Because now the story moves again. Back into the public world, where a queen must walk, mourn, and rule, alone, but not untouched. You leave the Indian room behind, stepping softly back into the main corridor, where the soft hum of palace life carries on, muffled footfalls, distant chiming clocks, the hush of age-old routines repeating themselves like echoes of memory. But the light has shifted. What was once dusky and warm now gleams with something colder, like moonlight on silver. You've entered the realm of duty, the public side of Victoria's grief, the armor she wore. You pass a series of display cases, their contents painstakingly curated, court documents, mourning brooches, black silk gloves, every item carefully tagged with its date and significance. Like grief could be archived into submission. This is where the myth takes shape, where mourning became not just personal, but policy. In the months and years following Albert's death, Queen Victoria did something remarkable. She refused to return to life as expected. She wore black every day. She refused most public appearances. She had his shaving kit cleaned and laid out each morning. She kept his dressing room just as he left it, and she never allowed his bedroom to be repurposed. Her silence became a spectacle. At first, Parliament was patient. The nation grieved with her. But after a year, then 2, then 5, the whispers began. A queen who would not be seen. A sovereign who did not reign, not in the old way. Some historians argue this was when Britain unofficially became a constitutional monarchy. Power slipped quietly from throne to parliament, while Victoria mourned, unyielding. But here's the strange thing. The people loved her more. Her sorrow made her human. Her unwavering devotion made her legendary. And in that liminal space between heartbreak and history, a symbol was born. You step closer to a velvet-lined display. At the center rests a black jet brooch, carved with forget-me-nots. It was a mourning gift she had made for herself. Around it lies a web of associated tokens, mourning ribbons, black-edged stationery, photographs with black crepe borders. It's like looking at an altar. Not to Albert, to grief itself. You can imagine it now, her seated at Windsor, pen in hand, reviewing state papers with a solemn air. Her every movement heavy with the weight of mourning. Her gowns were weighted too. Literal pounds of crepe and taffeta dragging behind her like shadows stitched into fabric. You feel it in your limbs. The way her joints must have ached beneath the black silk. The way her breath must have caught in corsets that offered no relief. Only the shape of duty. And yet she persisted. It wasn't just stubbornness. It was belief. Victoria believed that her mourning had purpose. That by honoring Albert so thoroughly, so completely, she could keep his presence close, and that this act would dignify her reign. In her mind, ruling as the widow of Windsor was ruling as his wife still. The monarchy became a shrine, and the people accepted it. You run your fingers along the edge of a framed photograph. Victoria in her later years, small, severe, black-veiled and unsmiling. But there's something in her eyes. Not just loss. Resolve. She had turned mourning into monarchy. Not despite being a woman, but because of it, and in doing so, she carved out a new model of royal power, not through conquest or charisma, but through image, through myth. Still, not everyone approved. Prime Minister Disraeli once joked that managing Her Majesty's grief was harder than governing the entire empire. And her son, Bertie, the future Edward VII, grew resentful, denied the spotlight, overshadowed by a father no longer living but ever present. The tension between mother and son became one of the palace's worst-kept secrets. She refused to pass him responsibility. She refused to acknowledge his readiness. Because how could he ever fill the place of Albert? And maybe, deep down, she feared that letting go meant losing Albert again. One historian wrote, "Victoria did not grieve as a widow. She reigned as one." And here, in these relics, that claim feels true. Because grief, in her hands, became sovereign. You shift your weight, and your knees whisper a complaint, another subtle echo of the heaviness she must have carried. Not just emotional, literal. Everything around her was dense. Her clothing, her routine, her silence. And it's hard not to wonder, did she ever regret it? Was there ever a night when she stared into the fire and thought, I could return. I could step out of the black. But if she did, she never showed it. Instead, she let mourning become her legacy. You move past the final case and into a tall chamber lined with windows. Outside, dusk bleeds across the lawn like spilled ink. And just as you settle on the windowsill, stretching your legs and letting your fingers brush the cold glass, you hear it, not sound, just the sense of it. That weight again. Only now, it doesn't press down, it surrounds, as though the very walls exhale her story. A story of a queen who slept alone not out of obligation, but out of fierce, unrelenting love. And just as the sky darkens fully, another memory surfaces. One more chamber waits. Small, hidden, quiet, but everything leads there. The corridor narrows once more, tapering like the end of a thought. You follow its curve as it snakes behind the grander halls, beyond the staterooms, beyond even the servants' roots, until you reach a short staircase. Steep and worn, the carpet long since rubbed thin by cautious footsteps. You descend. Your shoes barely make a sound. It's quieter here. The air is still, like the inside of a book long unopened. And the scent shifts, less of perfume and polish, more of linen and paper, lavender sachets and distant coal smoke. This is not a public space. It's not even a royal one. It's hers, the true private quarters, the little world where Queen Victoria ended every day for over 4 decades. Where she breathed not as monarch or widow, but simply as the woman who once shared a bed with her love, and then never again. You step inside the bedroom. It's smaller than you'd expect. Low ceiling, pale wallpaper faded by time. No gold filigree or ceremonial banners. Just a bed, 2 armchairs, a writing desk, a washstand, and beside the window, a simple set of drapes that haven't been drawn in years. But your eye goes straight to the bed. Not because it's grand, it isn't, but because it is split. 2 beds, side by side, one slept in, one untouched. Albert's bed, perfectly preserved, pillows fluffed, sheets smoothed, coverlet neatly folded back. Each morning, a servant prepared it as if he might return. Each evening, Victoria sat beside it, fingers tracing the embroidery, lips moving with unspoken prayers. Even now, it feels like the room is waiting. You walk slowly around the space, feet sinking into the thick rug, the air dense with the kind of silence that listens back. There are photographs on the wall. Albert's portrait, yes, but also images of their children. Letters framed beside sketches of Balmoral. A family held together by glue and grief. On the writing desk, her journal lies open to a page only partly written. The ink has faded, but you can still read it. 42 years tonight. I lit the candle as always. The left side of the bed remains smooth. I kissed the ring. My darling, your breath is in every corner still. You place your hand lightly on the wood. It's warm, not because of temperature, but because time lives here. Not in a grand, historical way, in the way a mother keeps her child's room untouched, or a widow never moves a husband's coat. This room wasn't just her retreat. It was her promise, and it came at a cost. She never remarried. She never let anyone else sleep beside her. Even on state visits, Victoria insisted on a private room. On ships, in castles, in hunting lodges, she carried Albert's memory like a second shadow. No companion, no late life lover, just echoes. People speculated. Was it devotion? Madness? A theatrical performance so deeply embedded it could no longer be undone? Historians still argue whether she honored his memory, or whether she imprisoned herself inside it. But standing here, you can feel the answer. It wasn't performance. It was ritual, like brushing your teeth, or kissing a child goodnight. It wasn't meant to be seen. It was simply done, over and over, every night, for 40 years. There's a small drawer beneath the bedstand. You hesitate, then open it. Inside, a dried rose. One of the hundreds she had pressed over the years. This one is crumbling at the edges. Its petals the color of parchment. And below it, folded in wax paper, a lock of hair. Albert's, tied with a blue ribbon. Labeled in her spidery script, "My beloved." For Balmoral, 1866. You sit on the bed, her side, of course. The mattress groans slightly, and for a moment, it feels like something exhales with you. Your body relaxes into the linen. Your knees no longer ache. The warmth of the room presses in like a thick wool blanket. You close your eyes, and you imagine it. Victoria, older now, her back hunched, her face carved by time. She sits here at dusk, just as you are now. Hands folded, lips murmuring to someone only she can see. Not because she thinks he's truly there, but because, well, what if? And maybe that's the point. Not certainty, but comfort. The way you keep your phone's last voicemail from someone you loved. Or the way you stare at a photo when your heart hurts too much to speak. This room is that photo. Frozen, but alive. You rise slowly. Heart heavier than when you entered. You glance once more at Albert's untouched pillow. You do not straighten it. You do not touch it. You leave it just as it is. Because love, real, aching, complicated love, isn't always about moving on. Sometimes it's about staying still. And outside this room, the palace breathes again. The past moves gently into the present. And just beyond the door, dawn begins to stir. The door clicks softly behind you as you step out. The hush of the royal bedchamber closing like the final page of a book you're not quite ready to finish. But you don't look back. Not because you're unmoved, but because something about that untouched bed demands reverence. You let it be. Your feet follow the worn path instinctively now. You know the rhythm of these halls. The way the light shifts with the hours. The faint rattle of windows when the wind rolls in from the north. And yet, you're not retracing steps. You're following the echo. The life of a queen who ruled an empire and built her world around an absence. You pass the door to Albert's blue room. Still locked. Still untouched. They say even her death was orchestrated as a final act of devotion. She wrote her own funeral arrangements years before she passed. Down to the placement of her body, the veil she would wear, and the objects she would carry with her into the grave. At the top of the list, Albert's dressing gown, folded and placed beside her in the coffin. Also, the plaster cast of his hand, so she could hold it in hers one last time. And her wedding veil, fragile, sheer, a whisper of a thing, laid gently over her face, as if marriage itself would carry her through the veil of death. Mourners filed past her body in awe, not just for the queen she had been, but for the widow she had insisted on remaining, an empress who wore grief like a crown, who refused to remarry, not because she lacked suitors, but because no one else could be Albert. She died in 1901. 63 years of reign. 40 of them spent alone, but only in body. Because in her mind, in her chambers, in her ritual, Albert was never far. Not in the lock of hair she kept in her locket. Not in the empty chair at dinner. Not in the silence that fell after her name was called and she didn't respond. He was everywhere, and when they finally laid her to rest at Frogmore, beside him, the queen who had refused to move on finally allowed herself to arrive. Together, they sleep beneath a marble tomb. The inscription is simple. Here at last, together. You let that line settle in your chest. Not like history, like a lullaby. And just for a moment, you picture it from above, the stone glowing pale under the moonlight. The ivy curling slowly up the sides, time humming softly through the leaves. No carriages, no scepters, just two souls at rest. And yet, even now, the empire she built still pulses. Not in palaces or crowns, but in something stranger. A room never dusted, a bed never shared, a love never unremembered. And that's where the story ends. Not with a bang, but with a soft, continuous breath. The kind you hear only when the room is quiet, and the person you love is no longer there, but somehow still close. So now, as you rest, the long corridors of that palace fade behind your eyes. The footsteps quiet, the gas lamps dim, the scent of lavender and coal dust softens into the air around you. No longer so heavy, no longer so sharp. Your hands relax into the linen, and your shoulders stop bracing against time. You don't need to remember every detail, every veil, every lock of hair, every unworn bed. You only need to let the silence hold you for a while. Because in the end, Queen Victoria's story wasn't really about mourning. It was about love. Imperfect, obsessive, enduring love. The kind that presses into the walls of a room and stays there long after the voices have faded. Maybe that's what kept her strong. Or maybe it's what made her fragile. Historians still argue. But you don't have to. Not tonight. Just let yourself imagine her again. Seated by the window. The veil in her lap. The light falling gently across her fingers. And maybe, just maybe, there's a part of you that understands her. That same ache. That same need to hold on. Even in sleep. Especially in sleep. So now, dim the lights just a little more. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts loosen. Let that empty bed soften in your mind. Not as a symbol of sorrow, but as a place where even grief was given a home. And in that stillness, let yourself drift. You're not alone. Not really. Not ever.